Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'm joined once again by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He is actually in town. He is in the shop with me, and I thought we'd have a little fun discussing a topic that could be controversial. I'm hoping it's controversial because it's an opinion that I have that's quite a strong one, and I'm just going to be really curious to see what his reaction is to it. Kevin has no idea what I'm about to present.
This is being sprung on me, whatever it is. We're experiencing it together.
It's in real time. And I want to, of course, start some conversation in the comments as well on this topic. Now, there are some people who won't care about either of the players in this little vignette, and that is fine too. But without further ado, I have this modest proposal to make. In my opinion, and this is something I think that has been overlooked in the history of popular music, I think that the Kinks are a more significant and influential band than the Beatles.
Oh. Okay.
That's the bomb.
Mm-hmm.
I have dropped it. And what is your immediate reaction to that? And then I will give my reasoning behind, we'll go point by point of my reasoning behind this opinion.
Well, when you first said this, my immediate reaction was this strange sort of skewed, distorted reality. It's like, in what reality does that make sense? That can't be the case. And then I pivoted back to the word influential. And I look at the Beatles and I immediately realize they set a standard. They set a template, a model for aspiration, for completeness of artistry. But if we're talking just pure influence, it's like, that would not have occurred to me. But when I focus on the word influence, I can look at it and say, if you look at what came after them, if you look at the tendrils of playing and singing and arranging and style and energy, sound. We don't have
sound is the word.
We don't have 1,000 Beatles now, but we have 1,000,
offspring of the Kinks, tens of thousands of offsprings, hundreds of thousands of offsprings.
Waves and waves of different musical, trends and generations that all connect back to that.
In 1964, when You Really Got Me came out, there had been Wichita Lineman, the screwed up fuzz sound or whatever, but there had never been an electric guitar that sounded like You Really Got Me, ever. The Beatles did not come out with I Feel Fine until 2 months later, which had some studio feedback in it, but it was not distortion.
Yeah.
Guitar distortion is the Kinks.
Mm-hmm.
How many recordings of guitar since the Kinks have featured distortion? Millions?
Mm-hmm.
Punk music, heavy metal music, I would argue prog, because their vignettes were much more musically sophisticated than the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's Sonics. Okay, the punk music wouldn't exist without the Kinks. The energy,
Sonics and stylistic
choices. The waves are felt to this day. Now there are deeper layers to why I think the Kinks have more cultural relevance. Much deeper levels. They were politically motivated. They were political commentators. The Beatles were spectators, or maybe they were the belle of the ball, or maybe they were the class president or the prom queen or whatever.
Do you resent the Beatles, Tris?
No. But the people who were actually in the wheelhouse, and doing real social commentary, not just riding a wave of psychedelia. The Kinks, dedicated follower of fashion, making fun of psychedelia. They were constantly criticizing and critiquing themselves, their generation, and not in a way like The Who did either. You know, Pete Townsend was too precious with his material. Ray Davies was not precious. He was very, very hypercritical of everything around him, both politically. Victoria, a commentary upon, you know, imperialism. They were ahead of their time with Lola, a critique of sexuality in a way that was uncomfortable for everybody to hear at that time. Became one of their biggest hits. They always didn't just have their fingers on the pulse, they were making their own pulse, and they were creating a narrative of their own that was not designed to please their audience in any way whatsoever. The Kinks never gave a shit about who they pissed off, including the two brothers together. Ray and Dave hated each other, you know. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that says a lot. If you look at the, you know, I think when I think about the Beatles, the classic line about the Beatles, which I think there's some truth to, is nobody can be better than the Beatles. And I think that that's kind of a double-edged sword, because with the Beatles you have an incredibly accomplished, refined, rarefied, you know, accomplishment of music. But after they got away from those first, you know, those earliest, you know, records, it moved away from the kind of immediacy that never really left with the Kinks. And the Kinks have all the energy and rawness and bravado of punk. But they have the sort of sardonic, self-aware detachment that goes beyond that. And so you have, but it's immediate, it's approachable, it's confrontational, it's all the things that the Beatles kind of, you know, stopped being after those first things. And when it comes to actual influence, that's what we saw, you know, balloon out of the Kinks' original era, was people running with that and that kind of energy and that approachability.
Well, the Beatles, you know, almost became self-parody. Helter Skelter. I mean, come on. You know what I mean? It's like they're pretending to be something they're not a lot of the time in their late career work. And I would argue in a lot of their solo work after the Beatles disbanded. The Kinks stayed the course. They eventually became an arena rock band. They ended their career with a hit called Destroyer, which is a paranoid hearkening back to their first hit, You Really Got Me, and All Day and All of the Night. And I think that they were true to themselves in a way that none of the other British invasion bands were, because they couldn't not be. It was in their character. It was built into Ray Davies and Dave Davies too.
So, okay, tell me how Come Dancing is not Paul McCartney solo material.
Okay.
Describe, those two things sitting side by side.
Okay.
Illustrate your point with that.
Okay. With something like Come Dancing, Ray Davies always played back to the Britishness of things, of his childhood. And when you go to some of what you would consider the cheesier stuff that the Kinks may have put out, he was embracing his own past and his parents' past. Paul McCartney did the same thing, but there's something simpering and something kind of... Paul McCartney always feels like a faker to me. Whereas I feel like Ray Davies was trying to genuinely like embody something that he couldn't quite do, because he couldn't quite sing right, he couldn't quite play the stuff exactly the way. Whereas Paul McCartney was such a chameleon that he dove in. Ray Davies' character and his prickliness and his wrestling with the difficulties of the past. Always still showed through. There's an authenticity there that you don't find with Paul McCartney's solo work.
In some ways, like you said, it feels like he didn't have any other choice but to be authentic. He was stuck.
He was stuck with more limited palette.
So he couldn't escape where he came from, but in some ways he wasn't trying to escape what he came from. He was taking his authentic character as far as it could go, musically, sonically, and things like that. But never really left it. Yeah.
He was a sophisticate, but he was also a working class person, you know, and that never left him. All right, so we got into some social critique.
Yeah, the simple question has been covered.
Yeah.
Beatles or Kinks?
The Beatles or the Kinks. I mean, to me, the Kinks are way more of a significant band and more important. Plus, they stayed together and they went through that whole 70s era and they made it through the 80s.
Yeah.
They survived and they thrived, because what people forget is they were one of the top grossing arena acts of the 70s all the way through the end of their main run in 86, 87.
Yep.
Kinks Live the Road. That came out when we were starting high school. I mean, they were still a vital force, both commercially and artistically, to a certain degree. You know, they suffered the same fate that all artists of their era, you know, suffered to a certain extent. I consider Destroyer to be their last signature song, you know.
But I think to some extent they're victims of that, what I call the memory hole. It seems like there's been like little troughs of collective cultural memory where significant things have gotten lost along the way. When you switched into the video age and the technology driving the music phase, it's like entire aspects of cultural significance just drop out of people coming into it after the fact, haven't picked up on the significance of the things you're talking about, even if the music they surround themselves with is saturated in it. Yeah.
Another key factor. They may have been just as big, but would they have been without the Kinks? Van Halen's first hit was You Really Got Me. A reinterpretation. The fact that Eddie Van Halen and company, but particularly Eddie Van Halen signed off on what Van Halen was going to do. And the fact that that song was chosen to be their introduction to the world. Is Eddie Van Halen perhaps the most influential guitarist of all time?
Is that the question?
No. Well, what I'm saying, I'm saying, there's a lot of people who would say yes. And there's a continuation from that 1964 fall release to You Really Got Me in 78 that carries that torch all the way through the 80s to the current day with people who are interested in heavy guitar, hooky guitar, shreddy guitar, because Dave Davies' solo was bonkers on You Really Got Me. That was one of the first examples of an electric guitar hero that wasn't just, you know, there were the blues guys doing things, but what he did was unhinged. He was trying to sound, he was taking the guitar to a place it had never been before with the insanity and the energy of it. And that's exactly what Eddie Van Halen carried just right over the goal line.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. He's, the way you frame that, he's right there at the hinge, the pivot point of this entire continuum of guitar and music. And my first thought is, you know, of course, when people talk about who's the greatest or the most influential guitarist, the name that comes to a lot of people is Hendrix. And I think with Hendrix, it's almost like with the Beatles in a way, where
he's his own thing.
He's his own thing. It's like
nobody can play like him.
How can you be better than Hendrix? How can you be more primordial than Hendrix? It's like being, who can be better than the Beatles? It's like, maybe it is impossible, but if we're talking about the extension of influence and creating the playing
I'm talking
field
about a narrative
for
through
everything.
Popular music. I'm talking about a narrative of sound
it
and
passed
attitude.
Through. Yeah, I think with Hendrix, it's like in some ways
it starts and stops.
It starts and stops, and it starts and stops. Even though there have been many acolytes of Hendrix over time, you know, you've got your Stevie Ray Vaughns and, you know, the current day, you know, sort of blues rock guys. So it's not that all influence stopped, but in terms of the continuing evolution of music and trends and sounds and things that are front and center in culture, Eddie Van Halen really was the filter for that. And just,
he created a whole new approach to the instrument. And I feel like Dave Davies did the exact same thing in 64, because you've got him playing a distorted rhythm guitar.
He literally broke what the standard approach was.
Yes,
he
broke
pushed it
everything.
far enough that he broke it, and the sound crashed into an entirely new space. And that really is, you know, that's what Eddie Van Halen did. There was a lot of loud guitar, a lot of rock, a lot of blues, and so forth, you know, coming away from the Kinks, but nobody broke, I would argue, some might have ideas, but nobody broke it again, I think, until Van Halen did, and he threw the doors wide open.
Yeah, I mean, you had the prog people. I mean, you had Hackett, and you had Fripp.
Yeah. I don't know if they broke very much, though. Fripp, I think...
Fripp codified a certain... He invented sequencer-style guitar, in my opinion.
And he brought in a whole different influence away from the blues into this, the sort of Bartok, the class, the European...
and then I always want to give Hackett credit. I know that there's old footage. There's a lot of footage of old-timey players maybe doing some tap stuff, but Hackett was doubling keyboard lines, which is what Van Halen's inspiration was, because he started as a piano player. Yeah. Okay, and let me
not to be overlooked.
Before we go down the I think we've made the Van Halen point at this point, and here is my other big distinction between the Kinks versus the Beatles that I think kind of really brings it all home. The Beatles ultimately were an introspective type of music.
Yes. Yeah.
It was a type of music you wrapped yourself in a blanket and you immersed yourself in, and you maybe felt safe and warm, or it offered you something. The Kinks' music was in the world and confrontational and made you question things and made you think. And
made you uncomfortable.
It made you uncomfortable at times, and it had an edge to it. And they also, their experimentalism was more successful, I think, than the Beatles' experimentalism with trying to push boundaries. Mm-hmm. Lola versus the Power Man is a concept album. Even the Village Green Preservation Society was a more successful realized vision to me than Sgt. Pepper, which the Beatles themselves admitted was a patchwork. So I would actually put it into the Kinks court with Village Green as being kind of the progenitors of a cohesive concept album. Mm-hmm. I don't think that Pete Townsend listened to Sgt. Pepper to come up with Tommy, but I think that he probably said, well, if the Kinks can make something like that, I probably can. And that's the kind of influence I'm talking about, is that they are approachable enough to where a person like me, I've covered the Kinks. I have released a song by the Kinks that I did myself. My son loves my version as well, but I can do it because I'm just, I have just enough ability to be able to do it. And that's the thing I feel about the Kinks, is that they've inspired so many people, because so many people can sound Kink-esque. Mm-hmm. It's attainable. And I think that there's just a certain authenticity and merit to it. And I put all of the Kinks' best songs right up there with any of the Beatles' best songs. Yeah, I mean, because really, when you boil it all down, the Beatles have 10 amazing songs. And if you take 10 of the Kinks' best tracks, Waterloo Sunset, Lola, You Really Got Me, and you throw those up against the Beatles' best, they hold, I mean, they're punching in the same class, in my opinion. Yeah. And I rest my case. I'd like to hear, my opinion is, I think the Beatles or the Kinks are a more significant and influential band in the history of music than the Beatles.
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to say like the Beatles are less authentic or inauthentic, but I think in some way the path that they pursued almost kind of went away from the question of authenticity to where they were kind of trying to transcend going off into some other world. It was breaking boundaries sonically in terms of engineering of recordings, melodically, musically. They were, building in a kind of richness that was not par for the course at all, that didn't have any maybe analog apart from Motown in terms of its musical richness and mainstream music. And so it's almost like outside authenticity, if that makes any sense, where it's
I get that.
I don't know if they're being phony as much as they're just sort of experimenting in a different sort of way, but it left that train of immediacy and confrontational accessibility that the Kinks never did leave. And so if you're looking at what followed, what people took influence from, obviously a lot of people have taken influence from the Beatles, but they've been, that didn't remain the sort of centerpiece. If you look at a band like, XTC, there's an incredibly accomplished band, incredibly authentic, incredibly just a phenomenal band, one of my favorite bands ever, but they were always on the periphery. They were never the center of the culture. The culture didn't follow that influence. The culture followed the influence that in the wake of the Kinks, and that ability to just pick up a guitar and bash an emotion out, confrontational reaction against what's around you, and what you're experiencing in the most immediate sense is not a Beatles thing. It's a "you really got me" thing. And Van Halen translated that energy, and it's wave after wave of bands and styles. It seems to just keep circling back to that. It
does. I mean,
whether it's the Strokes, whether it's the 10 years later, the sort of guitar and punk energy wave that came again. It's like that wave just keeps coming back and back and back, and it goes back to that Kinks energy.
It's a vital force. And what inspired this video is not because I want to take a big shit on the Beatles.
They're beyond that. There's no way
they don't care. They don't
brought...
care. Nobody cares what I think about the Beatles, because they're going to think what they want to think about the Beatles and say what they want about the Beatles. My son has been exposed to the Beatles since day one. I mean, Carmina, my wife, loves the Beatles, and so we've had Beatles music in our house. But just in the past 2 or 3 months, I played, for my son, I played "You Really Got Me" in the car, because I was like, this is the first song. This is like the first real, like, heavy rock song. This is the first, like, real, from my perspective in the world, the first real rock song. And I played it for him, and he was just like, whoa. And now he is just obsessed with the Kinks, and he listens to the Kinks constantly, all eras, all of it. And he's like, they are just best. They're the best. They have the best variety of songs. They have the best albums. And so it inspired me to kind of go back and re-examine the Kinks, because I've always been a huge Kinks fan.
Yes.
And for the record, they have always been my favorite British invasion band. Forget the Who, forget the Beatles, forget the Stones. I'm all about the Kinks. And so I just wanted to make a video to see what Kevin's reaction would be when I was just like, I think the Kinks are better than the Beatles.
Well, now that's a whole separate question.
That's a separate question.
You're changing the
No,
terms.
okay, I won't change them. But more, the most influential. And
so did you kind of think that maybe I would be like, no, you're full of crap?
I didn't know what you were going to react to, because I know that you're not a huge Kinks fan.
Well, in terms of just like pure enjoyment and listening enjoyment, neither one of them are my favorite group. But it's like, once you phrase the question this way, because better is subjective,
But as far as just pure influence in sonics, I think the Kinks are more influential.
How do you argue with that? People
are going to.
You can add up all the examples of Beatles influence, but their artistic influence, but maybe they're not. They haven't remained at the center of the groove of the culture in the way that the Kinks have.
I don't think they have, because when people, like I said, every once in a while there'll be something I'm at, and they'll use "You Really Got Me" or "All Day and All of the Night," and there's an instant there's a lurch reaction to it. It's like, it sends people into motion, and a lot of times the Beatles stuff is applauded, but not necessarily have a visceral response to it.
And I want to ask you one more question on this.
Sure.
I think we've established a really good case for their superior influence to this day. So why aren't they as widely renowned and beloved, and in an immediate sense, by the popular culture, and always the first name that comes to mind in the way that the Beatles are? That's a complicated question, but just give me your
easy to
impression.
answer. It's super easy to answer, and they will tell you this from their own mouths. I've heard this, and so they got kicked out of America. They fought and they drank and they did drugs and they got kicked out of America, and they couldn't tour here during what was it? It was like 1965, end of 65 to like 70. So for that critical half decade, they couldn't be at Monterey Pop Festival. They couldn't be at Woodstock. They also were not necessarily, they were not like pleasant people to the press. They were not fuzzy. They didn't play. They didn't have a good manager. They had terrible management. They got kicked out of America, and they were kind of assholes. So, of course, they didn't. They weren't darlings. And, you know, the Stones were still, you know, they were dirty and dangerous, but they were still cartoon characters for most people in the audience. And you could say the same of the Who with the, you know, they're kind of cartoon characters.
They had a baseline level of functionality that never sent them into the ditch. Yeah.
The Kinks went into the ditch, and they didn't care, and they were definitely not cartoon characters.
Yeah.
That people could be like, oh, you don't put the Kinks on a lunchbox. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And even that influence, it's like, well, that's why the Replacements weren't bigger than they were. It's like, you know, it's like they
were a mess.
There are analogous cases like this.
Oh, sure.
The could have, the should have, the really deserved to be from the quality of what they did. It's like they can be profoundly influential and still be marginalized in a lot of ways.
But that's the answer, really. It was their character. They were self-sabotagers, you know. So anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. It went way longer than I anticipated, but hopefully there's something of value here for you. If you've made it this far, a subscribe would be greatly appreciated. Likes, comments. I'm sure there will be comments for those who do make it through this video.
Tell us why this was all wrong.
Tell us why I was completely wrong and that the Kinks suck and are not influential. And we'll see you next time with more content. You take care.